I used to believe that love, real love, was something you nurtured over time. It wasn't fireworks or grand gestures, but rather quiet consistency. It was in the little things. Sharing meals. Folding laundry together, checking in after a long day. I believed love was like a garden. If you watered it, protected it from storms, and pulled the weeds when they started to grow, it would flourish. That belief was the foundation of my marriage. For 10 years, I lived by that principle, pouring my time, energy, and heart into a life I thought we were building together. My wife, Elaine, was never the loud or extravagant type. She didn't need attention from a room full of people. Her presence was subtle, soft even. Brown eyes that once smiled at me across the dinner table. A gentle voice that calmed me after a stressful day at work. I loved those things. I loved the comfort of our routine, the stability of knowing I had someone beside me who understood what we were building. I didn't need excitement or drama. I just needed her. Or at least, I thought I did. I gave her my loyalty without question, trusting that we were walking the same road. I never imagined that one day I'd come home and find that the foundation I had built was already cracked beneath my feet. That the woman I loved had been standing in the same house, but walking in a different direction for years. People talk a lot about heartbreak like it's a loud, dramatic event. But for me, it came quietly. It came in the form of a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. In the form of a voice I had loved for a decade. Saying words I never thought she'd say. That moment didn't come with shouting or confrontation. It came with stillness. It came with the scent of her favorite vanilla candle burning in the living room, and the weight of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood there in the hallway, listening to the person I had devoted my life to say that she didn't love me anymore. That I had become dull, predictable, and that she didn't know how to leave. And just like that, everything I thought I understood about love unraveled. You see, I had spent years believing that effort was enough. That loyalty and patience could carry a relationship through any storm. I believed that if you gave your best, it would be enough to hold something together. But love doesn't work that way. You can't carry a marriage alone, no matter how strong your shoulders are. You can't build a life with someone who quietly chose to stop building with you. That's the part no one really talks about. The slow, silent way love can rot beneath the surface while everything above it still looks intact. There weren't any big fights. There weren't any betrayals that made the news. Just distance. Just small moments of disconnection that I was too trusting to see for what they really were. A sigh when I talked about my day. A smile she gave her phone that she no longer gave me. A hesitation before saying, "I love you." That I convinced myself was just stress. But love isn't just about staying, it's about showing up. It's about choosing each other every day. And when only one person keeps choosing, it stops being love. It becomes endurance. I thought I was being a good husband by being dependable. I thought I was being strong by keeping the peace. But looking back now, I realize I was simply fading into the background of my own marriage, hoping that loyalty would be enough to make up for what was missing. It wasn't. The moment I walked out that door, I didn't leave because I stopped loving her. I left because I finally understood that love, no matter how deep or genuine, can't survive in a place where it's no longer wanted. It took me 10 years to learn that lesson, and I'll carry it with me for the rest of my life. Love deserves more than endurance. It deserves to be mutual. It deserves to be seen, heard, and returned. And when it's not, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Some betrayals don't come with broken dishes or slammed doors. Sometimes they slip in quietly through words not meant for you, slicing deeper than any shouted argument ever could. That's how it happened to me. On a night that began like any other, in the home I had worked so hard to build. With a heart still full of love for a woman I thought I knew. I came home later than usual that evening, weary from work but comforted by the thought of walking through the door, and hearing Elaine's voice. Maybe sharing a late dinner, maybe just sitting together in silence. The smell of her favorite lavender, vanilla candles hung in the air, warm and familiar, the way home is supposed to feel. I slipped off my shoes, loosened my tie, and was about to call her name when I heard her voice from the living room. At first, I thought she was chatting with a friend. Her tone was light, casual, like she was venting about something small. I might have smiled and gone in, but then I heard my name. Not in a loving way. Not in the way you expect to hear your name, when it's spoken by the person who shares your life. It came laced with something sharp, something cold. "Jackson just doesn't get it anymore," she said. Almost like a sigh. "He's so dull, so predictable. I can't stand him." I froze, the warmth I had carried home draining from my body in an instant. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink. I stood there in the hallway, unable to take another step forward. I clung to the doorframe like it could keep me upright. as if the words I was hearing might knock me off my feet. I wanted to believe I was misunderstanding, that it was some twisted joke or a moment of exaggerated frustration. But her voice wasn't playful. It wasn't joking. It carried the weight of truths she had clearly carried in silence for far too long. Then came the blow that shattered me completely. "I haven't loved him in years," she said. "I just don't know how to leave. He's safe. He's reliable. But I don't want reliable anymore." I had heard enough. I didn't need to hear another word to know that the life I thought we were living together had only existed in my mind. I was no longer a partner in our marriage. I was an obligation, a habit, a placeholder in a life she no longer wanted. There are moments in life that split everything in two. Before and after. That was mine. Before that night, I still believed we had something real. After that night, I couldn't pretend anymore. And yet, I didn't storm into the room. I didn't yell. I didn't demand answers. I stood in that hallway with a heart breaking in silence, trying to piece together how a woman I loved so deeply could look at me and feel nothing but suffocation. I think what cut the deepest wasn't just what she said, but the ease with which she said it. She sounded so calm, so matter of fact, as if this was something she'd thought about 1,000 times before finally saying it out loud. And I suppose that's what it was. The truth finding its way out. Not through a conversation between us, but through the comfort of someone else's ear. She didn't know I was standing there, but that didn't change anything. Those words were hers. That truth was hers. And it belonged to her long before I ever heard it. That was the moment everything changed for me. Because there is no going back from that kind of truth. There's no unhearing it. No forgetting how it felt to have your love reduced to convenience, your presence reduced to routine. I had spent years trying to be a good husband. Steadfast, loyal, present. But none of that mattered anymore. Not in the face of a confession I was never supposed to hear. That night, I learned something I'll never forget: betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes, it sounds like your name in the mouth of someone who no longer loves you. And that quiet kind of betrayal, the one spoken behind your back, not shouted to your face, is the kind that leaves the deepest scars. It's a strange kind of pain. Realizing that you've become invisible to the person you love most. Not because you did something wrong, not because you stopped trying, but simply because you were always there. You became familiar, dependable, predictable. And somewhere along the way, that comfort turned into indifference. I spent years believing I was building a marriage rooted in love and shared purpose. But it turns out I was just the background to someone else's life. A safe harbor she no longer wanted but didn't have the courage to leave. That realization didn't come all at once. It came slowly, in pieces. Like puzzle fragments that didn't quite make sense until they finally clicked together into one undeniable truth. It came in the way Elaine stopped looking at me. Not just with affection, but even with recognition. I was there, day after day, doing what I thought a good husband does. Showing up, listening, providing, loving her in the quiet, steady way I always had. And somehow, all that became invisible. I became invisible. The hardest part isn't hearing someone say they don't love you anymore. It's realizing they felt that way for years, and you never saw it coming. It's discovering that while you were pouring your heart into the life you were building together, they were slowly pulling away, step by step, while still sitting across the dinner table, still sharing a bed, still wearing a wedding ring they no longer believed in. When Elaine said she hadn't loved me in years, I felt something inside me collapse. Not just because of the words, but because suddenly, everything made sense. Every small sigh, every distracted glance, every moment where she seemed just slightly out of reach. All of it had been right in front of me. I just didn't want to believe it. I had convinced myself she was tired, that life had simply worn us down like it does to most couples after enough time. I thought love could survive on effort alone. I thought if I kept showing up, kept being the man I promised to be, it would be enough. But love doesn't work that way. It doesn't survive in silence. It doesn't thrive in comfort zones that have turned into cages. And it certainly doesn't grow in a space where one person is holding on while the other has already let go. The truth is, I had become a placeholder in my own marriage. I was the stable ground she could count on while she quietly longed for something else. Something undefined, something more exciting, more alive. And I suppose that's what hurt the most. Not just that she didn't love me anymore, but that she saw me as something less than love. Something safe, something reliable, something easy to keep around until she figured out what she really wanted. I never imagined I'd be that person to someone. I thought I was building something sacred, something lasting. But instead, I was just the comfortable option. The one who made life easier, not richer. And in some twisted way, I think she stayed because it was simpler than starting over. Because I made her life easier, not fuller. Because it was convenient. Not because it was real. That kind of realization changes you. It makes you look back and question everything. Every, I love you. Every touch, every shared plan for the future. You start wondering which moments were honest, and which were performed out of habit. And you begin to ask yourself a much harder question. If I hadn't heard her say it out loud, how much longer would I have gone on loving her while she kept pretending? I think that's what finally broke me. Not the absence of love, but the presence of a lie lived quietly, day after day, while I kept showing up, believing we were still in this together. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was her routine. I was her safety net. I was the man she stayed with, not the man she loved. And once you know that, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to believing love lives there. You can't keep showing up for someone who stopped seeing you long ago. So I left. Not because I wanted to stop loving her, but because I finally understood she had already stopped choosing me. Sometimes, the most painful truth is not that someone doesn't love you anymore. It's that they decided long ago, and didn't have the courage to tell you. Sometimes the most powerful decisions are the quietest ones. No shouting. No slamming doors. No bitter arguments played out for dramatic effect. Just a man standing in the silence of his heartbreak, picking up the pieces of his pride and walking away from the wreckage with nothing but his dignity intact. That's how I left her. Not with rage, but with resolve. When I stood in that hallway, listening to Elaine speak about me like I was a burden she had been carrying, something she had long grown tired of, a part of me wanted to charge into that room and confront her. I wanted to demand answers. To throw every word she said back in her face. To ask her how long she had been lying to me. I wanted to see her squirm, to make her feel the weight of the pain she had just dropped on me like it meant nothing. But I didn't. I stayed there, frozen in place, holding onto the last thread of composure I had left. I don't think people talk enough about that kind of strength. The strength it takes to choose grace over fury, when your heart has just been broken. The strength it takes to say nothing when your soul is screaming. To walk away when everything inside you wants to fight for a love that no longer exists. But that's exactly what I did. I didn't say a word. I didn't make a scene. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Instead, I turned around and went into the bedroom. I pulled an old duffel bag from the closet and began packing. My hands trembled, my mind blank, my body numb. I wasn't even sure what I was doing. It just felt like the only thing I could do. Like some part of me already knew this chapter was over. And dragging it out would only deepen the wound. I folded shirts, grabbed my toothbrush, shoved socks and shoes into the bag without thinking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. On my way out, I passed by the dresser and saw the wedding photo we'd taken nearly a decade ago. The one where we were smiling so wide, arms wrapped around each other. Eyes full of promises we thought we'd keep. I stared at it for a second longer than I should have, wondering how something that once felt so solid could dissolve so quietly, so invisibly. I wasn't just grieving the end of a relationship. I was grieving the man I had been in that photo, the version of me who still believed love was enough to keep two people together. When I stepped into the living room, Elaine looked up at me, her phone still in her hand, her smile fading the moment she saw the bag. For a second, confusion flickered across her face. And I could see the questions forming behind her eyes. But I didn't wait for her to speak. I didn't give her the chance to lie her way through this moment. I just stood there. And when she finally asked what I was doing, I simply said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." And I walked out. There's a quiet power in refusing to beg. There's a rare kind of self-respect in leaving with your head held high, even when your heart is breaking in two. I didn't need to scream or demand closure. I didn't need her to explain the years of indifference, or to apologize for making me believe we were still in this together. Because the truth is, sometimes closure isn't something you get from another person. Sometimes, it's something you give yourself the moment you choose yourself over someone who stopped choosing you. I didn't leave to punish her. I left to protect the last pieces of myself that hadn't yet been diminished by a love that had quietly faded without warning. I left because I finally understood that staying wouldn't fix anything. It would only teach her that it was okay to treat me like I didn't matter. And I mattered, I always did. I just forgot for a while. That night, I didn't leave with anger. I left with clarity. I left with strength I didn't know I had. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking back toward myself. After I walked out that door, the world didn't stop. The cars still moved along the road. The streetlights still flickered in their quiet rhythm, and the stars still dotted the sky like they didn't notice everything inside me had just collapsed. That was the strangest part. Life went on. completely unaware that mine had been appended in the span of a few minutes. I got into my car, sat behind the wheel, and stared at nothing for a long while. My hands were clenched so tightly around the steering wheel, my knuckles turned pale. It wasn't anger that kept me frozen there. It was emptiness. A hollowness that echoed through my chest, like something had been scooped out from inside me, leaving only space where love used to live. You always think you'll react a certain way when your heart gets broken. You imagine rage or tears or the sudden urge to scream into the wind. But none of that came. There were no tears, no screaming, no flurry of emotion to match the weight of what I had just heard. What I felt instead was silence. A quiet, suffocating stillness that wrapped around me and wouldn't let go. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was just gone. Somewhere inside myself where even I couldn't reach. I started the engine without knowing where I was going. I just needed to move. I needed distance. Between me and that house, between me and her. Between me and the version of myself that had believed so deeply in a love that no longer existed. The road stretched out in front of me like an escape route I hadn't realized I'd been needing for a long time. I drove through empty streets, past dim storefronts and closed gas stations, feeling like a ghost moving through a world that didn't see me. Eventually I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner just off the highway. It wasn't anything special. A flickering neon sign, a cracked sidewalk, a few cars scattered outside. But it was open, and I needed somewhere to sit, to breathe, to figure out what came next. I stepped inside and took a seat at the counter, my body heavy, my mind still spinning. A woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a kind smile. She poured me a cup of coffee without asking, like she'd seen my kind before. Maybe she had. Maybe heartbreak has a look to it, and I was wearing it plain as day. She asked if I'd had a rough night, and I let out a breathless laugh. I didn't explain. I didn't have the words, and even if I did, I wouldn't have known where to start. She nodded gently and walked away, giving me space I didn't know I needed. I stared at the coffee for a long time, not drinking it. Just watching the steam curl into the air like something trying to escape. I felt like that steam. Fleeting, shapeless, disappearing into nothing. I sat there thinking about all the little moments I had ignored. The nights Elaine had turned away instead of reaching for me. The way her eyes didn't light up anymore when I walked in the room. The way she always seemed just a little too tired, a little too distracted, a little too somewhere else. I had chalked it up to stress, to routine, to the passing years. But deep down, I think I knew. I just wasn't ready to face it. And now, sitting in that diner, I realized how much of myself I had lost, trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. That was the hardest part. Coming face to face with the version of me that had stayed too long, loved too blindly, and hoped too hard. The version of me who believed that loyalty alone could keep something alive. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I just sat there, feeling the weight of it all settle over me. And for the first time, I understood what it meant to feel nothing and everything at once. That in-between space where grief hasn't fully arrived, but joy is already gone. I don't know how long I stayed in that diner. Hours, maybe. But when I finally walked back outside, the sky had started to shift. A faint light breaking across the horizon, soft and uncertain. And maybe that's what healing looks like. Not a sudden change. Not a dramatic moment of clarity, but a quiet beginning. A breath in the middle of the wreckage. A whisper that says, somehow you're still standing. There comes a time in every broken relationship when the truth can no longer be avoided. The silence becomes too heavy, the distance too wide. And the things left unsaid begin to rot whatever remains of what once was love. I didn't plan to confront Elaine. I had already walked away. I had told myself I didn't need to hear more. That I didn't need her explain words she had already spoken with such certainty. But sometimes life has its own plans. Sometimes, it puts you face to face with the very person you're trying to outrun. Not for the sake of reconciliation, but to give voice to the pain you've carried in silence. She found me the next morning, sitting in a worn-out booth in that small diner on the edge of town. The coffee in front of me had long gone cold, but I hadn't touched it. I was just staring out the window, watching the world go by like a man who no longer knew where he belonged in it. I heard her voice before I saw her. Quiet, hesitant. The kind of tone you use when you're not sure if you're still allowed to speak. Jackson, she said. I turned slowly, already knowing it was her. She stood there just inside the door, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face somewhere between regret and desperation. I didn't say anything right away. I just looked at her, studying the woman I had shared a life with for 10 years. So familiar and yet, in that moment, so far removed from the one I had once loved. You left, she said, like it was something that surprised her. As if she hadn't handed me the very reason I had to go. I didn't disappear, I replied, calmly. I walked away. She sat down across from me, her eyes searching mine like she was still trying to figure out how much I had heard, how much I knew. But I didn't give her room to dance around it. I leaned forward, voice steady. I heard everything. She flinched. For a moment, she didn't speak, and then she began to fumble through half apologies and soft excuses. I didn't mean what I said, she claimed. I was just venting. I didn't know how to bring it up. I was confused. I listened. Not because I believed her, but because I wanted her to hear her own words out loud. I wanted her to feel weight of them in the air, to see them reflected in my eyes. And when she said, "Every couple has rough patches," I finally spoke. A rough patch doesn't last for years. A rough patch doesn't make you look at your partner like a stranger. A rough patch doesn't make you say you haven't loved me in years. She looked down at her hands, twisting a napkin between her fingers. I was scared, she whispered. I didn't know how to leave. I nodded slowly. But you did know how to stay. And that's what you chose, to stay, to pretend. To let me keep believing we were still in this together while you waited for something else to come along. You let me carry this marriage alone. The silence that followed was heavy. She didn't argue. Not this time. Maybe because she finally understood that this wasn't about blame anymore. It was about truth. And truth has a way of laying things bare. Even when you're not ready for it. You don't want me, I said. You just don't want to be alone. She didn't deny it. And that was all I needed to hear. For the first time since the moment I heard those words in the hallway, I felt something shift inside me. Not closure exactly, but clarity. The kind that doesn't come from forgiveness or apology, but from finally naming what's broken and deciding you won't carry it any further. When I stood to leave, she looked up at me, eyes glassy, voice barely audible. So what now? I paused, not to hurt her, not to make her feel small, but to make it clear, for both of us, that the chapter was over. Now, I said. I learned how to live without someone who was already living without me, and I walked away again. Not angry, bitter. Just finally free. Letting go isn't always a moment of triumph. Sometimes, it's quiet and sobering. Sometimes it feels less like freedom and more like grief. But even in that grief, there's a truth that begins to rise. One that tells you it's finally time to stop holding on to something that was never really holding you back. It took me a long time to understand that. I thought love meant staying, no matter how difficult things got. I thought commitment meant enduring the silence, the cold glances, the distance that had grown between us like a wall neither of us was willing to acknowledge. But I've come to learn that real love doesn't ask you to shrink yourself in exchange for companionship. It doesn't ask you to pretend you're happy just to keep something familiar alive. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in peace. After I left that diner and put those last words between us, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I had won anything. If anything, I felt like I had lost a version of myself I'd spent 10 years trying to protect. The man who believed he could love enough for two people. The man who thought patience would eventually bring her back to him. But in that space between loss and clarity, something else began to take shape. Something quieter, steadier, more honest. I wasn't just leaving Elaine. I was leaving the illusion I had built around our marriage. The idea that if I just kept trying, she'd eventually see me again the way she used to. The road stretched out before me, unfamiliar and uncertain. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have a plan. But I knew I couldn't go back. Not to that house. Not to that version of life where I was constantly trying to prove I was worth staying for. I needed something different, something mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't answering to anyone else's expectations. I wasn't trying to be who someone else needed me to be. I was just trying to figure out who I really was beneath all the roles I had taken on. Husband, provider, fixer, peacemaker. I drove for hours, watching the world blur past my windows. Each mile put more distance between me and the man I used to be. And strangely, I didn't feel lost. I felt weightless. I wasn't running away. I was simply choosing not to stay stuck. There's a difference. When you've spent years feeling invisible in your own relationship, any step forward, no matter how small, feels like liberation. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the driveway of my brother's house. We hadn't talked much in recent years, life getting in the way it always does. But when I called him, there was no hesitation. Just a quiet understanding in his voice that told me I didn't need to explain everything right away. Sometimes, family doesn't need the full story to open a door. They just need to hear the exhaustion in your voice, and know you need a place to land. That evening, we sat on his porch with 2 beers in our hands, and no pressure to fill the silence. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like I could breathe. No pretending. No walking on eggshells. Just space to exist, to unravel, to be human without needing to perform. He asked me, eventually, if I regretted it. Leaving, walking away from the life I had built for so long. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I don't regret leaving, I said. I regret not leaving sooner. And I meant it. Because now, even with all the uncertainty, even with the ache that still lingers in the quiet moments, I know I'm finally walking towards something better. Even if I can't see it yet. Something real, something honest, something mine. And maybe that's what healing really looks like. Not forgetting what you lost, but learning how to live with it. And choosing to move forward anyway. Not because you're over it, but because you finally understand you deserve more than a life spent waiting to be loved. Jackson's story isn't just a tale of heartbreak. It's a quiet, powerful testament to self-respect, clarity, and the painful beauty of letting go. He spent a decade pouring love, patience, and devotion into a marriage that had long since lost its heartbeat. He didn't see the signs until the truth hit him in the most unexpected way. Through words not meant for his ears. But instead of reacting with fury or desperation, he made a choice that few have the courage to make. He walked away. Not because he stopped loving her, but because he finally started loving himself enough to leave. His journey wasn't filled with dramatic endings or triumphant revenge. It was filled with quiet moments of reckoning, emotional unraveling, and the first honest steps toward a life of his own. What he gained wasn't just distance from a failed marriage, but a deeper understanding of his worth, his boundaries, and his capacity to begin again. The lesson in this story is simple but profound. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from what no longer nourishes your soul. In life, don't confuse comfort with love. If you feel unseen, unheard, or unvalued, don't wait for permission to choose yourself. Healing begins the moment you do.